The world is a very challenging and is in a very troubling place right now. And I want to thank all of you for inviting me to this event to launch the Transnational Repression Scholarly Working Group. I applaud the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy for this initiative, and we need more expert attention to this growing problem, because it is a growing problem. New Lines has a record of leadership. I recall your 2021 report, which assessed China's treatment of Uyghurs against the 1948 Genocide Convention, the first to do so. And the report found that the Chinese government bore responsibility for committing genocide. It helped us make the case in Congress for the passage of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. Sadly, the Uyghur people frequently become the victims of transnational repression. I think of the staff of Radio Free Asia's Uyghur language services, who bravely continued their work even though Chinese authorities locked up their relatives to punish them. Those same people are now out of jobs as the Trump administration seeks to eliminate RFA. I think it's outrageous that our own government is re-victimizing people who have suffered transnational repression. Transnational repression is when human rights violations cross borders. But what does that mean? Policy experts have given us a clear message. We need a definition. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has issued a fact sheet listing prevalent forms of transnational repression and common effects on persons targeted. It is very, very useful. And we need a definition in U.S. law. That is why I have joined Representative Chris Smith, my co-chair of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, and Senators Jeff Merkley and Dan Sullivan to introduce the Transnational Repression Policy Act. The bill would define TNR for our government and provide tools to strengthen interagency coordination. Now, it has been sitting idle in the House Foreign Affairs Committee since May of 2023. I don't know why the committee has not taken up this important bill. I will ask them again and urge you to ask them as well. We need some action on this. This should not be a heavy lift. This should not be controversial. I have chaired several hearings on transnational repression in both the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission and Congressional Executive Commission on China. We have heard compelling stories from witnesses and received policy recommendations. We can elevate the issue, but these are not legislative commissions. We need action from the committees of jurisdiction. At our most recent hearing last June, witnesses addressed cases of TNR in Hong Kong, Kazakhstan, India, and Pakistan. This heinous practice is widespread, I'm sad to say. But as we advocate for cases, we find that policymakers don't treat them equally, and that's a problem. TNR by some governments is treated as serious, while others waved away as politically sensitive. We need to be consistent on all human rights issues. It is wrong to be able to treat this issue differently because of political sensitivities. Human rights advocacy is most effective when we put politics aside. The inherent worth of an individual is not conditioned by how any of us feel about the government they live under. This is why the Transnational Repression Policy Act is special. It provides a policy framework that is universal, not tailored to one country or another. Likewise, policymakers should strive to eliminate double standards when addressing TNR cases. In addition, we should not let disinformation undermine our efforts. Now, you may have heard that supporters of former Brazilian President Bolsonaro, who is now serving a 27-year sentence for planning a coup, are claiming to be victims of transnational repression because the Brazilian judiciary is holding them accountable for their role in the coup. That is not TNR. It is not. That's justice. Transnational repression is real and it is serious, and we cannot allow our efforts to be subverted by those with ideological agendas. It doesn't matter whether the government's right or left or somewhere in between. If they are engaged in transnational repression, all of us should come together and call them out. We should take action. So again, I want to say thank you to New Lines for having me here today. I want to thank all of you for being here and understanding the importance of this issue. I will continue to be an ally on this issue, both in the Tom and I do Human Rights Commission and on other commissions that I'm on, as well as on the House Rules Committee, continuing to raise these issues of human rights. I mean, people who come to the United States oftentimes fleeing political persecution in their homeland should not have to be open to political persecution in our land. And to the extent that that is happening, and it is, we need to do more about it. So count me in as an ally. I look forward to any recommendations that come out of this meeting. And again, at a time when some of us are looking for hope, because so much seems to be happening in the world right now, this gathering here gives me a great deal of hope. Thank you and all the best.
Thank you, Representative McGovern, for your comments and your time. Our next speaker is going to be Dr. Azim Ibrahim. He's the Chief Strategy Officer at the New Lines Institute, where, as part of his duties, he directs the Transnational Repression initiative.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, today we are launching the Transnational Repression Working Group at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy because we believe a line has been crossed and because the global response has not kept pace with the threat. Transnational repression is no longer a niche human rights concern. It is a strategic challenge to democratic sovereignty. Authoritarian regimes are increasingly willing and able to reach beyond their borders to silence critics, intimidate diaspora, coerce families, and manipulate legal and technological systems inside democracies themselves. What once relied on blunt instruments has become more sophisticated and more networked and more normalized. This is why the New Lines Institute is doing this work now. We are a think tank built to identify emerging threats early, connect rigorous scholarship to real world policy, and convene coalitions that would not otherwise exist. Transnational repression sits at the intersection of human rights, national security, technology, law enforcement, and foreign policy. Yet too often, it is treated as none of these fully, and therefore falls between institutional cracks. And the threat itself has evolved dramatically. Authoritarian states are no longer relying solely on assassinations and kidnapping, though those still happen. Today we see digital harassment, campaigns against activists abroad. We see spyware used to monitor journalists and dissidents overseas. We see the abuse of extradition mechanisms and international policing systems. We see coercion of family members back home as leverage against those who speak freely overseas. We see community infiltration. We see forced surveillance within diaspora and the normalization of fear as a tool of control. But perhaps most concerning is that we are seeing states learn from one another. Tactics pioneered in one region are now being adopted elsewhere. Transnational repression has become globalized, modular and replicable. That means democratic responses must also become strategic and anticipatory. This is where this working group comes in. Led by my esteemed and brilliant colleagues, Dr. Elise Anderson and Mr. Charles Walsh, what we are launching today is the first global coalition of its kind anywhere in the world. It brings together leading scholars, legal experts, technologists, regional specialists, and practitioners to build a shared analytical framework for understanding transnational repression as a system rather than isolated incidents. Our goal is to clarify definitions, map methods, track patterns, and translate research into concrete policy options for governments and legislators around the globe. But research alone is not enough. That is why the New Lines Institute is also establishing a high-level advisory committee composed of former cabinet-level officials and senior policymakers from democratic countries. These are individuals who have ran ministries, overseen national security portfolios, managed intelligence relationships, and navigated the realities of government decision-making. Their role will be to guide our work and stress test our findings and help ensure that our research speaks directly to the policy space where the change actually happens. This combination is deliberate. Scholars bring depth, independence, and analytical rigour. Former senior officials bring realism, institutional memory, and an understanding of how the policy moves or doesn't move. Together they create a bridge that is too often missing in this field. Today's launch here in Washington, DC is only the beginning. Transnational repression is a global challenge, and our response must be equally global. Over the coming months, we will be launching this working group in democratic capitals around the globe, including in the British Parliament in London, in the European Parliament in Brussels, the Canadian House of Commons in Ottawa, and the Australian Parliament in Melbourne. Each launch will engage local lawmakers, civil society, and affected communities, because transnational repression manifests differently in different contexts, but thrives on the same vulnerabilities. And let me end with this. Transnational repression is designed to make people feel isolated, powerless, and invisible. It thrives when democracies treat intimidation abroad as someone else's problem. By launching this working group, we are sending a clear signal that these tactics will be studied, will be exposed, and will be confronted systematically. Democracies cannot defend freedom at home if they allow fear to be imported from abroad. This initiative, make no mistake, is about protecting the integrity of the democratic space itself. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much for being here and being part of this beginning.
Thank you, sir, for those moving comments. Our next speaker is Dr. Elise Anderson. She is a non-resident senior fellow at the New Lines Institute, as well as a professorial lecturer at George Washington University.
Good morning. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for joining us for this event today. I do want to extend my thanks to Representative McGovern and his staff for making time to join us earlier for those powerful remarks, to staff of the CECC for their assistance in planning some parts of this event, and to my colleagues at New Lines, particularly Charles, who are doing so much of the unglamorous, behind the scenes, and very necessary work that made this event a reality. We really wouldn't be here today without Charles. Transnational repression has in many ways shaped the last half decade of my professional work, and I think that many of us in this room can say that. I am a specialist on Uyghurs. I lived in their homeland for nearly 4 years to conduct doctoral dissertation research, and since finishing that research and my graduate studies, have worked in human rights and international development capacities with Uyghur diasporas across the United States and the world. I have come to know this issue, transnational repression, through the very human impacts. That's why I'm sharing this, right? I have had contact with hundreds of Uyghurs who have recounted to me and continue to recount how China's long arm has reached into their daily lives, far outside the PRC. harassment by invasive and, of course, unsolicited WhatsApp messages sent by police back in their hometowns, regular targeting via digital campaigns meant to infiltrate devices and steal private information, use of coercion by proxy or the harassment of family members back home to demand the silence of people on the outside, abroad, community-level spies who in some cases may have been recruited to spy via coercion by proxy, have in several prominent instances that we know of infiltrated advocacy organizations and diaspora communities. On the more extreme, perhaps more extreme physical end of the TNR spectrum, Uyghurs who have been living in insecure, politically insecure third countries have long faced the very real threat of refoulement to China. And we saw that happen very devastatingly in Thailand just short of a year ago. Some Uyghurs abroad have been targets of bogus Interpol notices, and others have reported attempts on their lives that they suspect originate with the Chinese state and its proxies. The effects have been detrimental. Large numbers of the diaspora report depression and anxiety. Some powerful advocates have receded from advocacy altogether, halting their work. And many more people have been convinced never to speak out in the first place. These are the human impacts. I'm talking about Uyghurs now, right, because that is the focus of my own expertise, but I do recognize, of course, that this issue goes far beyond Uyghurs. On a work trip to South Asia in 2024, I spoke with Tibetan researchers and advocates recounting similar experiences of transnational repression. Mobility controls, curtailed freedoms of expression, and beyond, right? And of course, the issue goes beyond China origin communities as well. And our TNR initiative at New Lines, the working group that we are launching, is endeavoring to address that and speak to that in the work that we are producing. And China may be the world's most aggressive perpetrator of transnational repression, but it is joined by many other states in perpetrating that repression. So as all of us sitting here know, pioneering research and analysis that was started by Freedom House in 2020 has been behind the elevation of TNR to the status of a major policy issue in this country and globally. And it was heartening to see what happened in the wake of that. Civil society coordination, a real response, muted as it might have been from multiple parts of the US government. So parts of Congress, the executive branch, began to take action in multiple ways. And there was a lot more going on behind the scenes that we never saw across government and across civil society. And so in formally launching the scholarly working group at New Lines, we join a field that is populated by really excellent ongoing efforts at research analysis, policy advocacy, and coordination. Right? There are civil society coordination groups headed by Freedom House, working groups in places like the UK and Germany, and those are just some of the many efforts that we join. Sadly, right, despite all of this excellent work between 2020 and 2025, the winds shifted a little bit, and that's certainly true in this country. But globally, authoritarian states appear just as emboldened as ever to perpetrate and or assist in the perpetration of acts of TNR as host countries. Despite our collective best efforts, in other words, the problem of TNR is far from being solved. Funding streams for advocacy organizations that have documented and analyzed TNR in this country have been cut off. Programs that were stood up to support community protection and coordinate global networks for advocacy with democratic governments have been hit hard and terminated altogether in a number of cases. And so, in other words, our working group is coming together at a time when the US movement to address TNR is facing real challenges, and we acknowledge that and hope that we can help the collective, right, to think about how we address this. So far, a half dozen of scholars and legal experts have signed on to our group, and we are recruiting people on an ongoing basis, where we plan to convene quarterly sessions where sharp and bright analytical thinkers will share observations on current trends, track hotspots of repression, share their ongoing research, brainstorm ways to bridge research and policy, and I think overall strategize how the collective of people working to counter TNR can effectively push legislators in North America, Europe, Australia, and other places to take action. We have already published a couple of excellent reports on the US response to TNR, on Interpol abuse. Those were authored and co-authored by folks you will hear from shortly in one of our panels, Dr. Ted Broment and Sandra Grossman. And we also have an exciting slate of reports in our publication pipeline, which we look forward to sharing with you in the coming months and year. These reports will shed light on the historical, legal, human, and political dimensions of TNR, always with a focus on moving the legislative needle and on convincing policymakers to take concrete action. And we hope to have all of you along with us as engaged readers, perhaps even as working group participants and New Lines report authors. So we hope that today is full of engaging and thought-provoking discussions for all of you. I know I am certainly looking forward to hearing what our speakers have to say and to the exchanges that will follow. Thank you.
Unless you are there.
Take it away.
Thank you, Elise, for those comments. And as a personal note, I want to thank you as well for all the work you do on this initiative. You really are the subject matter expert that drives all the work that we do here. So, yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone. That concludes our sort of keynote statements. We're now going to break for a brief 15-minute coffee break.
All right, so we're going to get started on our first panel, which is looking at the impacts of TNR. We have this topic purposely a bit broad, but we are joined by four really amazing experts whom we have invited to give 3 to 5 minutes of general remarks of their choosing on that broad topic. So I'm going in alphabetical order by last name, starting with Tenzin Dorji, or Tendor, who is a senior researcher at the Tibet Action Institute and a lecturer at Columbia University. So Tendor.
Yes. I actually want to later.
Okay, sure. So we will go to Nate Shankin now, who is an independent human rights researcher. From 2012 to 2025, he worked at Freedom House, most recently as senior director of research, where he designed the first global data set on transnational repression and helped create the policy agenda for addressing it. Nate.
Thank you. It sounds like it's working. So first of all, thank you to New Lines, thank you to Elise and Charles, to the Congressional Executive Commission, to Representative McGovern, whose remarks earlier. It's really wonderful to be here with all of you, to see so many people with whom I've worked, so many people who've been affected by transnational repression, so many people who've fought against it for so many years. To speak a little bit about the impact. Over the many years that I've worked on transnational repression, I've interviewed now dozens, maybe hundreds of people affected by transnational repression from dozens of countries. I've interviewed Turkish people who themselves have been kidnapped by the state, as well as their family members, sometimes within days or weeks of the kidnapping. I've interviewed Russians who are taking extraordinary precautions to prevent being killed while they're abroad. I've interviewed Rwandans who can't get a cup of coffee with anyone from their country because of fears of surveillance. And what I always remember from these conversations, what haunts me, is the fear people feel. The sense they're being watched, that it could be happening right now, that it could happen again, that they could be next. And the fear they feel for their family members, for their loved ones, the responsibility that they feel to protect them, which, as Elise said in her remarks earlier, often leads them to stepping back or taking steps that make their activism harder, or sometimes simply causes them to abandon their work. This transnational repression is continuing now. I know we're going to talk more about the details and kind of the nuances of how, the different modalities, the different ways in which transnational repression takes place. Every year that Freedom House collected data on the number of incidents and the number of perpetrators or origin states, it grew. I imagine it'll be growing again. Freedom House releases that data in a few months for the last year. And the purpose of TNR that we see reflected in this impact is to instill exactly that fear. It's to prevent people from speaking. It's to prevent people from assembling and from associating. It is designed to shape our societies through illegitimate coercion. It's a means to make people less free. And that's why we have an obligation to struggle against it, and most of all in the country where we live. So I'm very proud of the work that I've done. I'm very proud of the work this community has done. And I think we should all honestly, especially in times like these, lean on that, and lean on each other, and the fact that we've all continued to work on this and on the many human rights issues that we support, including fighting transnational repression. Now, I wish I could end there. I wish that could be sort of the content of my remarks, but I think given that we're in DC and that we're in the United States, I do have to speak about the policy situation in the US. To be clear, I've been working a lot, especially in the last 6 months, but even before when I was at Freedom House, on the global policy agenda in Canada, Australia, the UK, Europe, as well as other countries in the Global South. And that agenda is continuing. In a lot of ways, I think there's a lot more momentum now outside of the US on the TNR policy agenda. But in the US, unfortunately, we're seeing a whole new kind of risk factor emerge. Those of us who work on transnational repression as experts, we know from the scholarly literature and from the existing research that the biggest risk of transnational repression comes when there is cooperation between the host state and origin states. Most cases of transnational repression have an element of cooperation. And we know that this kind of cooperation is more likely when host governments adopt policies that violate the rights of immigrants and asylum seekers. That's what's happening in the United States right now. The current administration's mass deportation policy, which is a policy priority, it's a stated priority, we all see it happening around us, seeks to curtail and reduce the already quite weak due process protections that immigrants, migrants have in the United States. It's resulted in third country deportations, sometimes in violation of court rulings, specifically prohibiting them, and it's placed people at risk of chain refoulement, where they are taken from those third countries back to their origin country. There has been overt cooperation with authoritarian states that are seeking people, including Russia and Iran, widely reported, well documented, in mass deportations to those countries, including the dissidents. This is a vast increase in the risk of transnational repression in the United States. I think as a community of people working on transnational repression, we have an obligation to address these issues as part of the fight against transnational repression. If we're serious about fighting it, we cannot focus on it as if it operated within a vacuum as a policy issue. We have to build, we have to restore fundamental rights and protections for people in migration in the United States. Thank you, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Nate. So next we will come to Ajanar Sitawalde. Ajanar is an immigration attorney and also has very deep experience and expertise working on human rights and international development programming in diaspora. Ajanar?
I do want to say first and foremost, thank you to the New Lines Institute. Really happy that you're taking this step to develop this coalition on TNR and the CEC as well. I want to say that I agree with your remarks with regard to the current situation in the United States and the heightened risk that individuals that are already vulnerable to TNR are facing because of that. I guess we'll have a little bit more opportunity to discuss that. At least you touched on earlier on some of the tactics of TNR, especially that perpetuated by the Chinese government. You talked a little bit about the impact. Representative McGovern talked a little bit about that. So I want to focus my opening remarks a little bit more on the evolving landscape of TNR, particularly that targeting the immigrant community. We're seeing some transforming trends here in the Uyghur community. We are seeing that the PRC is really shifting from the blunt type of harassment to a more sophisticated drive to really normalize this narrative that the Uyghur region is returning to normal. We're seeing a more of a carrot and stick approach in recent months specifically. In November, Human Rights Watch reported with regard to the stick method that China is working with Turkey, where they're really utilizing Turkish law, so systematic lawfare, to marginalize Uyghurs who don't have access, who are being stripped of their legal status, where there's a legal limbo that makes them even more vulnerable to chain resettlement. So in recent years, China hasn't directly deported any Uyghurs to China that we know of, but there is now a heightened risk of deportation via third countries. We're also seeing more recently Chinese government efforts to engage members of the diaspora, members of the Uyghur community from the homeland, bring them abroad in this normalization drive. So most recently, I believe this Sunday, there were a group of 40 Uyghurs who were taken from Urumqi, from Turkey to Urumqi. They were part of this family reunion delegation organized by the Chinese consulate in Istanbul, and basically engaging unity performances where they were reunited with their families in Urumqi, but heavy media coverage, coverage of this in the diaspora as well. And I've been just over the past 2 days scouring Uyghur social media, looking at the disappointment within communities, even some prominent activists really feeling disenchanted with the environment, given that things like this is taking place. And I think this is this chilling effect was heightened by the deportation of more than 40 Uyghurs in Thailand last year in February, where the world did have an opportunity to stop this deportation, and we were unable to. And I think more Uyghurs now are making this calculus between reuniting with their families, giving up their basic rights, and feeling that they don't have the protection from their host countries, and that host countries are increasingly going to be cooperating with China rather than striving to protect them. I also want to highlight this emerging draft law in China. It's the National Ethnic Unity Law that just underwent its second reading in December. That also has implications for transnational repression. It formalizes Beijing's global reach for ideological control. There are several articles that are very alarming. Article 17 states that authorities should propagate ideological uniformity through exchanges and cooperation among Chinese and foreign academia, civil society groups, and think tanks, as well as diaspora. Article 61 explicitly states that individuals and organizations outside of China will be held legally accountable for acts deemed to undermine national unity or interfering with ethnic policy, effectively criminalizing human rights advocacy in the diaspora. And then this framing of external human rights documentation, advocacy work as hostile infiltration or interfere really provides them sort of a rule of law veneer for suppressing dissent in the diaspora. And I think given the more recent developments, if this law would go through, this chilling effect, the silencing of diaspora is really going to increase, especially as Nate noted, where states also, like the United States, where there's a situation where individuals just don't feel protected.
Thank you, Anjanor. Next, we'll go to panelist Jill Francois, who is the Executive Director of Human Rights in China and a leading voice on democracy and human rights. He has firsthand experience and a deep understanding of transnational repression.
Thank you. It's a best way to start a new year. Last year, this time, Elisa and I, we were working on a joint project on this until it was terminated within a month. I'm glad seeing the level now here. I agree with the speakers before me. The situation now is definitely getting worse overall for the diaspora community against the terrorists in the home country. I work very closely with grassroots communities against the CCP. I have many stories that's very interesting. I'll just tell some stories here. I'll start with most recent one this weekend. Some Chinese dissidents were celebrating the arrest of Maduro because he was the friend of Xi Jinping. And guess what? While they were doing this in the public space, someone hired by the consulate of CCP came out and pepper sprayed them very close, very aggressively. This actually for Chinese, this is commonplace and was attacked while San Francisco police were watching. Rushan was there as well. It's almost 20 years ago. But the good news, something we can be happy is that this is the first time the perpetrator was arrested and detained for 2 days, and he's released now. But this is the first time. Just think about that of all these attacks by CCP gangsters here. This is the first time that we have seen a real arrest on the spot. And that just brightens the mood of all these people. Because just this kind of situation is very difficult now. For example, if you get into physical conflict, you might be charged by police. Actually, the leader who was in this protest on Sunday, he was charged by US government because he was attacked during the San Francisco visit of Xi Jinping in November 2023. And now, he can face as deportation immediately if all these are connected. So there's lots going on there, but there's good reason to be happy for a moment. So that's one story. Another story, probably we all know now, some of us know, Guan Heng. He was the Chinese on his conscience. He visited Xinjiang and visited firsthand the concentration camps. But he thought he would be free here. That's why he released the video, like when he believed he would be here. But when he arrived, he was exposed online by a Chinese influencer, and his family were interrogated by Chinese police, and he had to hide himself, even though he being here, and now he's in ICE detention. And this is a story that echoes through all the people here. So everyone is watching. And what's complicated now is that we have another story about this, about the recent smear attack on him that's apparently coordinated by CCP from China, but it's happening on Twitter, and it was supported by a lot of people who are seemingly against the CCP, and this is kind of the power that CCP has now, they have infiltrated the community, not only the Chinese community here, but even the online platforms. Sometimes they can dominate on some topics. Wow. Okay. I have lots of stories to tell, but maybe later so that's Guan Heng. Yeah, he is in detention here. He is a champion for the freedom of the Uyghurs, and at about the same time, I was working on trying to release another person, Tara Zhang Yadi, and she was arrested in China for what she did in France. She was part of the Chinese Youth for Tibetan Group, and mainly for what she posted online. She was arrested and charged with separatism in China. So that's another story. I have a lot. We can keep going later.
Yeah, well, thank you. I think we're going to have a lot to talk about and a lot that can come up in the Q&A and also in this break and networking time. And so last but not least, we will loop back around in the English alphabet to Tenzin Dorji, who is, as I mentioned before, a senior researcher with the Tibet Action Institute and an adjunct professor at Columbia University.
Thank you. Thank you, Elise. Thanks for the extra 15 minutes to help me recover from my hangover. Earlier, when our Congressman McGovern was speaking, he mentioned visiting His Holiness in Dharamsala, and it made me think of this really famous book by the Dalai Lama. It's called Freedom in Exile. Came out many years ago. One of the great books on Tibet and the Tibetan experience. And in those days, actually, freedom in exile was a real thing. People, when they came out from oppressed countries into the free world, they were indeed free. And I do remember the good old days when on university campuses, in various communities, whenever there were political conversations, political discussions, panels, speakers coming to campus, everybody would go and participate. And I remember seeing many Chinese students actually coming to those talks, political talks, participating, asking questions, debating, discussing, And right now, we just live in a completely different world. And on a campus like Columbia, I see lots of students who are from Tibet, from China, from East Turkestan, from Hong Kong, but for the most part, students who come from the mainland PRC never go to any of those discussions because they live in fear. For them, it's like they're still living under watch, And just wanted to mention, especially the Tibetan case, since I hang out with a lot of people, I've talked to so many people in the Tibetan community. What I've noticed over the last 5 or 10 years is like a less dramatic form of transnational repression, but more widespread, a kind of a quotidian transnational repression where it's not the tactics, high-profile tactics like kidnapping or poisoning or assassinations, but it's much more ubiquitous, ordinary forms of tactics of intimidation of relatives back home, threats to do certain things that the regime doesn't have to do actually, but these are just threats, and through some really sophisticated, massive use of these tactics over the course of these years, how I have seen so many people in my own community just retreat into non-participation, retreat into silence, retreat into fear. And when it first began, it kind of started with with a very strange point. I'd call it a window of the exiles were always free for a very long time, but I think it began with this kind of window of vulnerability when people started, this generation that came into exile, they started to have their aging parents who are now getting ill. They need help, they need visits, they need people from, they need their children to visit from abroad. And this window of vulnerability created a line of people who wanted to get visas to go and visit Tibet, China, right? And the visa is such a scarce commodity because the Chinese government controls it with such ruthless miserliness, and there's a very good reason why they do that. But because they control it so strictly, they can buy anything with the visa, and that's what they buy. They buy silence, right? And they've had it all figured out. It's not just the point of people applying for the visa at the Chinese consulate. It's once they do get a visa, if they do get a visa. If they don't get a visa, their data is already collected by the government, right? Which family members are back home. If they do get a visa, then the trip is also managed. And during the trip, the kind of things that they are told, the visitors are told, all of these things basically amount to a situation where people initially began masking when they went to protests. The Tibetan protests of the 90s and the 2000s were actually very famous. Everybody knows, we've seen those huge protests, thousands and thousands of people. People began masking, and slowly they were just too afraid to go. And right now, you are seeing, the decline in protest participation in the Tibetan community, and I'm sure it's very similar for other communities as well. So I think initiatives like the Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act, for example, the legislation that passed a few years ago, led by Congressman McGovern, and some of our champions of human rights in Congress, and I think those type of legislation actually has a huge impact. The CECC did a lot of work to make those things possible. And I think those types of bills and laws, they have a huge impact because I think what it tries to do is it tries to make access to Tibet open, right? When access is limited, the Chinese government can use it to buy stuff and sell stuff. But when it is open to anybody, then it would take away a huge important weapon away from the hands of the Chinese government. So that's one example. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Right. So I know I have a lot of thoughts and questions, but you probably don't want to hear me talk more. So I would love to open it up to the audience here for Q&A. We will be passing a mic around for the sake of accessibility and the live stream. So if you would please raise your hands, we'd be happy to start the Q&A portion. Anyone? Roshan there in the back.
I have a couple questions on the online stream.
Oh, great. Some questions from the live stream to get us started. Thanks.
So we have a question on the panel's opinion on the bill that was talked about by McGovern and Smith, and how it might address the problems and issues that are being raised by the panel. We think that bill will address it directly or from it.
Yeah, sure. So the Transnational Repression Policy Act, I think it's an excellent bill. I mean, in fairness, we worked on it at Freedom House. I worked on it quite a lot for several years. And I think the version that we have now is even stronger than what we had a couple of years ago. I think it's gotten more focused and a bit more well-framed in terms of the original design. So for those who don't know, I mean, kind of the key components of it are providing this definition, definitional material in US law, mandating certain kinds of trainings and responsibilities at state, at DHS, at justice. and then authorizing appropriations for those things. So in that sense, it's a very very baseline kind of bill, but I think that it's definitely very positive. I think that it would definitely contribute on all of these issues that we're talking about. I will say, and I have to reflect on this given my remarks, I mean, it's not going to address kind of the core issues in our system more broadly around due process, around protection against refoulement. I would state from my perspective, and I'm sure we'll hear from others in the rest of the conversations today, I mean, these are things that are longstanding issues in the US system, or there are things where, frankly, the position had been that this was settled law. So refoulement is illegal in the United States, just like it's illegal in all, members of being called. Sort of things. I don't think it's a fire alarm. I think they all need to go to the floor, right?
Oh, yeah, they have.
Yeah, exactly. So that is to say, does Congress need to take action more firmly to protect against refoulement in the United States? Perhaps. But from a legal perspective, I don't think there's a question that that is illegal and that the law is being broken. And we're in an unprecedented crisis in a number of ways in the United States around, can the executive simply go ahead and do these things, right, without any accountability? So I don't know that this bill won't address that, and it can address that. Maybe there is other bills. That's a question more for the immigration lawyers out there, for other kinds of lawyers. But at bottom, I don't know that that's so much a legislative issue as it is kind of a, balance of powers between the branches.
We have a question up here.
Thanks. Jesse Bernstein, Security Fellow with the Truman National Security Project, and thank you to the panelists for your remarks and sharing all of your experiences. About the definition and the current time, we've just witnessed, such a tremendous act of extraterritorial targeting with the U.S. behind it. I mean, how does that fit into the debate about TNR? And I think one gap in all of our work on this issue is public outreach. A lot of the terms that we've been using are very technical. So, given this new day of extraterritorial targeting by the U.S., I mean, how do you think we actually explain the problem to the public about TNR, which you all have articulated, and the impact on communities and the fear? How do we really branch out, given what we're up against right now?
It's very simple.
There's no takers. I'll sacrifice myself. Okay, say it does make our work.
I'll speak to it. I mean, sorry, I'll toot my own horn. So I wrote a long piece in the Journal of Democracy that came out in the summer about transnational repression, in which I talked about the influence of the global war on terror and the U.S. security models, which have been openly emulated by a number of countries that are engaged in transnational repression. I think this reinforces that. Anytime we're signaling that international norms are either negotiable or simply don't exist and can be violated with impunity by the powerful, we're signaling as well to other powers that they can and should do the same thing. And that's been very consistently a pattern. I mean, I came to this work through the Turkish kidnapping campaign that started after the coup attempt in 2016. And that produced hundreds of renditions around the world, which are still very under-discussed, I will say, among people outside of the specific communities that work on this. And the Turkish government media specifically talks about the war on terror when they talk about those campaigns, about those kidnappings. And they specifically use the same tactics that the United States used in the war on terror. So I don't think it's a question about whether there's a connection. There's obviously a connection. It does make the job much worse. It makes it much harder. I don't know if I can answer the communication question other than to say we have to talk about it. I don't think we should be ignoring connections between these different actions.
All right. Okay, I think there's a question at the back and then we'll come to Sophie.
Hi, Rachel Nelson with the New Lines Institute. I'm wondering if you have any insights as to why legislation regarding TNR has stalled or has failed to pass. Is it just a lack of understanding of TNR within the US, or is it more of a hesitancy to pass legislation that might target some of our allies who are engaged in TNR abroad?
Crack at it. I feel like Representative McGovern said a few words about it, but maybe haven't.
Well, I don't want to be one. I don't want to monopolize. So first of all, just to be clear, there is a legislation that was passed. I guess it was 2018, 2019, the TRAP Act, Transnational Repression, Accountability, and Prevention Act, which is even more narrow. It really is focused primarily on interpol use. Good bill. A lot of people here supported it, and it has some impact. This bill and the work on it has been going on for several years. I ascribe it, frankly, primarily to the difficulty of passing anything in Congress right now. Not just right now, but over the last several years. I mean, we have a very serious problem in the United States with passing legislation, to be frank. And I think everybody who works with the Hill and works in DC knows that most bills get introduced without a hope of passage. I wouldn't put this bill in that category. I think this is a bill that has a hope of passage, but it is still relatively narrow because, frankly, it's like 95% or something of bills just never get passed. Most of Congress's work doesn't lead to legislation. So I don't really think it's about the actual bill itself or the policy issues. It's really just about Congress.
Does anybody else on the panel want to weigh in? Or shall we go to Sophie? Sophie.
Hi, I'm Sophie Richardson. I'm the co-executive director. And just some of the points that people have been making, kind of to answer just to say that whenever democracies commit human rights abuses, it is a gift to Beijing. But in fact, at least I actually wanted to put a question that may seem mercifully practical to you. I'm a little bit taken by the word scholarly in the description, of the work, of the effort, and frankly of the outreach and understanding. This is sort of what Jesse was getting at. I'm curious to know whether the purpose of that word is that most of the research is about what's happening to people in academia or what's happening on campuses, or the perspectives that you're wanting in the working group primarily about that universe. But obviously we've also talked about immigration, we've talked about other realms. And I'm curious to know, especially because several of the panelists have made comments talking about the larger ramifications of TNR. It doesn't just happen to an individual on a campus or in a business or seeking asylum, right? There are larger ripple effects for different communities. So I'm just curious about how expansive you are, both in the perspectives in the group itself, but also as you're taking the work forward and trying to seek different kinds of allies, from communities that are affected above and beyond an immediate political sphere like legislation passed, or communities that we know are affected by academia. Sorry, it's a big and messy question, but I'm curious to know where it is you hope to get to, especially if, as Nathan is rightly suggesting, legislating these things is so incredibly difficult. Are there other communities, who can adopt different policies and step in and be helpful in ways that would help us? Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Sophie. Sure, I'll take a stab at that really small question. Like all of the questions today have, been small and need just small, simple answers. Actually, the kind of more simple thing is the first part, a response to the first part of your question, which is, we did hem and haw to an extent over what to call our working group. And the word scholarly is meant, I think ultimately we settled on it to just in part to distinguish it from other working groups, which is not to say that other working groups or coordination efforts are like not scholarly or not intellectual, but that we are convening scholars. And we are trying to be a platform for people who are working on this issue in maybe a more academic context, which we know doesn't always translate well to, public-facing reporting or policy-oriented recommendations, right? So that platform element, bridging the academy and policy spheres, is what is meant with the word scholarly. And I think in terms of the bigger or perhaps, thornier part of it is of like, where are we going to go? Including if the US continues not passing the Transnational Repression Policy Act or other legislation or taking other action. I mean, we are not setting out in this with a geographic restriction, right, just on working in the US, although we want to, since the US has been such a leader on this issue. Up to this point, we're looking at engaging with other governments. We're looking at engaging with, scholars, people thinking and talking and writing about TNR who have really important insights to share, from different countries, different regions of the world. So we do want to be expansive in our thinking and how we understand the issue, and continue to get, really good stuff out there that moves the needle in some ways. It doesn't, and we're gonna have to collectively figure out, right? How do we solve this issue? Can we make a broader public, not make, but can we do something to ensure that a broader public does care about this and see about this? I mean, that is one of the big questions that I think is central to the work, and we're gonna be figuring out together.
Can I add something to that?
Yes, please.
I agree with what you said, and I think the problem of transnational repression is too big for one discipline to solve or one domain of study to solve, and for the scholarly community alone to solve. But I think an initiative like this could kind of like give it could be the launching point to basically spark a broader discussion, collect more evidence, produce new stories and new narratives. But eventually, I think it will definitely have to be a combination of the scholarship plus the community's involvement, plus academic university involvement, plus student bodies. And I think it definitely helps to have, legislation on this kind of issue in a really huge way. But at the same time, I think the participation of the community and the broader public and mainstream media, public-facing work is also really important, because I think it's, in a way, it's a narrative battle as well. And if we can create a situation where there is, right now, it's kind of a taboo. This conversation is taboo among the people who are doing it, among the people who are victims of it. People don't like to talk about it. And every time I speak to somebody who's a direct victim of transnational repression, I try to connect them to the media. I try to connect them to somebody who's doing research. They say, no, I don't want to talk about it. And I think anything we can do to destigmatize this issue and kind of like, take the taboo out of the issue so that people can speak about this more freely. People can come out of the closet, and start discussing and also self-reflecting or there needs to be more community level, public level, self-awareness of the self-censorship. And I think that could start, also help us turn things around a bit. So I think, making the conversation eventually public, high profile, broader public is really, really important.
Yeah, I'll follow up more on this. As much as we have complaints about the United States, I really appreciate what has changed since 2018. There's lots of positive going on that haven't happened in other democracies. For example, year 2020, our meeting was shut down by Zoom, and that was reported by every major news media. Then FBI follow up. It is very thorough investigation and found out that Zoom actually had someone on their payroll that's MS agent. If you look into the report, it's out there. It didn't name the company directly, but it's pretty clear. So this was like the first time I felt that there's some protection here from the United States. I think the law enforcement definitely has done a much better job in understanding the situation, but it's more on federal level, much less on local level now. For example, the Boston case where Chinese students threatened graduate when the graduate student posted something about Chinese democracy, and the guy was exposed. There's lots of reports. FBI did a good job collecting evidence, and he was convicted, sentenced to 7 months in prison. I think that's proper. And then, was surprised that after this guy, Wu Xiaolin, the perpetrator, spent like 4 months in prison, Chinese government exchanged him with a very high-level Pastor Lin, I believe, was in China for 10 years, and the United States was trying to get him out, and China switched this guy. For Pastor Lin, you never know what happened there. Got a big target. He means a lot to Chinese government, apparently. But I think that now the good things are happening. So this kind of law enforcement we haven't seen in any other countries. For example, my friends in Australia, they're facing a very difficult time. The police are pretty much always on the opposite side. When it comes to CCP, Transnational Repression on the ground. That's really terrifying. That's still happening. Another aspect I think that's positive is if we can help find compensation for the victims of transnational repression, especially when, for example, U.S. companies are involved or Chinese companies who have tangible assets here, the court can step in. That's where I think there's a lot of good development that can really change it for the long term.
Any more questions? Oh, yes.
Yes. Hi. I'm Ahmed Sarakoglu with the National Council on Civil Advocacy. And to Nate, thank you for your leadership and scholarship for a long time, following the news about Turkey and extradition, kidnappings, and all the transnational repression impact that people had. The upcoming NATO summit in July is going to be held in Turkey. And if the United States is not going to be the champion of this issue, TNR human rights broadly, how can the European countries in NATO play a part, since you are working with different reports? And are there ways for them to put this in the forefront of the discussion, highlighting the principles and values of NATO alliance and the countries who are part of this?
Thank you. I guess I'll take it in this direction, which is to say I don't know that NATO is going to be much of a forum for it because of the structure of NATO and kind of what the concerns will be and what the focus will be. There has been a lot of attention to the G7 under Canada's chairmanship last year. Canada really did a big push to make transnational repression a priority for the G7, and that has produced a very good leader's statement in June that enunciates a lot of the things that we all hoped to see. and kind of sets a baseline for G7 member state commitments. That continues as well, I will say, in the participants in that G7 process, as well as sort of their affiliated countries or countries, including in Europe, in Canada, in Australia. And I think that there's a lot of room there, to be honest. There's more room. This is the thing that I know I've been quite pessimistic about a number of things in my remarks, but there's a lot of room outside of the US right now. There's far more room than there was 2 or 3 years ago. And we've kind of had breakthroughs, for instance, in Canada and Germany, in the UK to some degree, although it depends on who you talk to. So I disagree with you about whether those breakthroughs are real, but there's a lot to build on. And so I would encourage people who are engaged in advocacy or engaged in this policy work to use the words, to seek out those points of contact, to seek out other experts who are working on to find those points of contact, and then to press forward. And whether that winds up being something that comes to fruition through a NATO engagement. I mean, we have Interpol experts here. I know the Interpol General Assembly was just held in in Morocco. Yeah, but we have obviously a very important Turkey element within that. Keep pushing those points of contact and keep pushing those leverage angles, because there are opportunities as well outside of this.
Do we possibly have any more live stream questions? Yes.
We do. So this next question is, the US has returned people who were supposed to have protection under CAT and other mechanisms to third countries, and some to origin countries as well. Are there any cases of people being returned to their origin countries that you think were prompted by their origin governments seeking to target them?
So I think that this comes to just a very specific question of how much we know about the specific cases. I've tried to obtain that information on very specific cases involving the Iran and Russia deportations, but haven't received it. So I think, if there's people in this room who have contacts with those lawyers or representatives of those individuals and they'd like to speak, I'd be very glad to speak with them and talk about those cases. I think that from a broader framework perspective, we know that there has been direct cooperation, at least in the public reporting, there has been direct cooperation with the authorities of those countries in those mass deportations. So those authorities were approaching, working with the United States and coordinating those deportations. Whether they requested specific individuals is a second question, but there was certainly cooperation with Iranian authorities and with Russian authorities in the deportations, which I think constitutes transnational repression. I don't think we should need to put too fine a point on it.
Within the context of diaspora and China, I believe most of the cases, there is an indication of to China. It's usually third countries that are designated as countries of deportation. And so I know several cases where the judge has granted withholding, which means that they won't be returned to their country of origin, but they're going to be detained or continue to detain them until they can find a country that's going to take them. And right now, it's just a strange list of countries that are showing up as those designated countries.
Sandra Grossman, I just wanted to address this. My law firm represents several individuals, including a group of West Africans that were deported. They actually have withholding removal, protection under the Convention Against Torture, so alternatives to asylum. They were picked up in the middle of the night by ICE, over 13 of them, and there's more since that case, and to Ghana, who then promptly referred them to the very countries where they had established protection claims in the United States. We actually filed a request with the UN Committee Against Torture and obtained provisional measures against Ghana, who's a signatory to the Convention Against Torture. The provisional measures have had a moral force, perhaps, but not any practical effect on the condition of these individuals. We are also working with the Iranian American Legal Defense League and are aware of numerous cases where the Iranian chargé d'affaires
in the United States was actually visiting these people in ICE facilities, had been told that they had been asylum applicants, which is a direct violation of US asylum law. So I absolutely agree with Nate that we are engaging in our own type of transnational repression here.
Thank you so much, Sandra. I will be hearing more from Sandra in the next panel. I'm looking forward to that. In these last few minutes, I want to try to stick to time. I just thought I would turn things back over to the panelists. If any of you have some concluding thoughts or something else you'd like to share, you could have about 30 seconds to a minute each. We'll wrap things up, and then if other questions the audience, those of you in the audience had, you'll be free to ask in the break that follows.
Yeah. I think they've all provided examples of how the Chinese government weaponizes fear to target and fracture our communities. With each incident of TNR, our communities receive a message from China that China's watching, they're planning, and they will continue to harm unless we comply. And increasingly, compliance isn't just silence, it's performative loyalty, unity, it's engagement in their propaganda, and laundering of their narrative. I hope that one day we can send back a message that we're watching too. We're analyzing your tactics, we're developing our own mitigation tactics, and working on developing strategies to counter your TNR. And we're working to protect the individuals and communities that you're targeting. Ideally, this would be a message that we send not to China, but to any country that engages in TNR. I think with this initiative and the bill, which I'm hoping will pass, we'll be moving a step towards that direction of being able to send this message to China.
Yeah, I think from what we observe, CCP, their tactics are always evolving, adapting, always new ways come out. So we need to do a lot of work and connect very closely in grassroots community. For example, recent years, I think the lawfare, some in the United States, they are trying to utilize the laws here, for example, attacks the NGOs, the individuals by looking at U.S. laws and regulation filings. It's very, very sophisticated work. So on our side, to be very alert, vigilant.
Just very briefly, I guess I'll just end with words of encouragement. I mean, I think the folks in this room have worked on this. This is the largest number of people working on TNR in the US, who have spent years working on this, and we're still working on it. A lot has changed in the last year, but we're still doing it. We're still making progress. We're still going to keep fighting. So thank you for that, and keep going.
I would just say, I know our situation here sometimes makes it more difficult for us to talk about issues like transnational repression, but let's also keep the long view and recognize that the problems that the US has right now are a bug, they're not a feature of American democracy, whereas the problems that the Chinese government is creating for its own people inside China and for citizens living abroad, and free citizens in the free world, those problems, they are not a bug, they are the feature of the Chinese government's authoritarian repression and totalitarian repression, as well as other autocratic regimes in other countries. So let's take some hope and courage from the idea that I think that resilience of freedom, human rights, ideals of liberty and democracy that we have in this country are stronger than any one person or any one administration. So keeping that view, the long view and a far vision of what we should be doing, I think we should continue this work in spite of what may be happening on a day-to-day basis. Thank you.
Well, so on that note, we will wrap up this panel. Thank you so much to all of our wonderful speakers for this. Thank you to the audience for in person and via live stream. We will break for the next 15 minutes and panel 2 will begin promptly at noon. Thank you.
Welcome back. This is going to be starting our panel 2, the need for legislative action on TNR. I'm going to, similarly to the previous panel, I'm going to introduce the panelists and then offer them a couple minutes for prepared remarks. So we're going to start with Dr. Ted Broman. Dr. Ted Broman was formerly a lecturer in history at Yale University and for many years a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation. He now runs his own business, Broman Expert Witness Services, where he works to defend victims of transnational repression through Interpol. Ted, you want to get started?
Yeah, thank you very much, Charles. I appreciate the introduction. And as someone who in a former life was an events planner, I really appreciate all the work that I know that Charles has put into this event. These sorts of things are a huge burden on us. Thankful to Charles. I'm also thankful to McGovern, to Dr. Ibrahim, and to all of the attendees today for their focus on this very important issue. I want to talk for just a few minutes about what I think is the biggest single challenge to legislation countering TNR, and that is that countering transnational repression through legislation is in one way or another about changing U.S. law enforcement. Either legislation on TNR means making it harder for foreign oppression to find its way into the U.S. legal system, or it means making it easier to charge foreign oppressors through the U.S. legal system, or potentially both. In other words, it means telling the Department of Justice and DHS how to enforce the law. And in any administration, DOJ and DHS don't like this, partly because they see law enforcement as their prerogative, and partly because they fear the negative consequences for their own lines of work about being forced to take TNR concerns seriously. That's why I think we need congressional leadership on this subject. And fortunately, as the previous panel discussed, Congress has shown some leadership in this area, and it has been bipartisan leadership, a fact that I'm extremely grateful for. I believe that the congressional framework for approaching TNR, which is centered on law enforcement, is the correct approach, and I'm glad to see that Congress continues to take this approach. In fact, there are currently 5 bills on TNR currently pending in the House, where there are 4 bills, and 1 in the Senate. All 3 of these bills have some things in common. First, they set out a policy objective of opposing TNR in the United States. Secondly, they define TNR. And third, they focus on improving law enforcement's response, usually through better outreach, better training, and or research to TNR in the United States. The various bills have various strengths and various weaknesses. I do really want to shout out Representative McGovern and Representative Chris Smith's and Senator Merkley's TNR Policy Act, which has a particularly good statement of policy, focusing on the need to protect people, to cooperate with allies, and to prosecute perpetrators. But rather than pit all of these bills against each other, cage match style, I want to emphasize 3 things that we should have learned by now about legislation on this subject and indeed on love bugs. First, mandating that the executive branch come up with a strategy does not work. Congress does this mandate a strategy thing a lot. Unfortunately, if the executive branch responds at all, the requirement almost invariably comes an exercise in box checking. That's what happened. The last major piece of legislation on this subject, the trap revisions in the 2022 NDAA that my friend and colleague Nate mentioned earlier. Second, mandating reporting only works if the executive branch is both willing and able to report meaningfully. Leaving aside the fact that the U.S. does not have a definition of TNR in law, and therefore it is very difficult to report on it, there are very roughly 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States, and only about 100 of them are federal. I do want better reporting, and there is obviously a major role for the federal government to play in opposing TNR. But I do not think we can grasp the totality of TNR in the United States when we focus exclusively on executive branch reporting on the federal level. Third, and my friend and colleague Nate mentioned this earlier, Congress now rarely passes standalone legislation. Therefore, it is unlikely, however much I regret this, that any of the 5 bills now pending in the House or Senate will become law as they stand. If any of their provisions are to become law, there are probably 2 realistic vehicles. First, there is state and foreign ops, and second, there is the NDAA. Of these, I prefer the NDAA because, although I am not a parliamentarian, I fear it is going to be very hard to get provisions that affect law enforcement in the United States into state and foreign ops. That is probably going to be ruled out of order. By the same token, some provisions in the currently pending legislation might not be appropriate for an NDAA. By and large, those are provisions that I'm more willing to do without. Now, of course, all of this is about the second part of stopping TNR, stopping foreign TNR, not about the first part, preventing the U.S. legal system from being infiltrated and becoming an agent of TNR. But as far as stopping foreign TNR goes, which is what this legislation is about, I would focus on a few things. Focus on building consensus among supporters of all of the current legislation on a few key provisions that could fit into the next NDAA and that allow the executive branch as little discretion as possible in implementation. And then do what Congress too often fails to do, which is hold the executive to account. In other words, put a few eggs in one basket and then wash that basket very carefully. This would not be the expansive legislation that at least some members of Congress could support, and in theory, I entirely agree with them. But it would be legislation that could be passed through an appropriate legislative vehicle and that would actually do some good. And that really is the point. Thanks.
Thank you, Ted. We now turn to Dr. Yana Gorhovskaya. Yana is the Research Director for Strategy and Design at Freedom House and has worked on the issue of transnational repression since 2021, co-authoring over a dozen reports on the topic. Yana, you have the floor.
I think that on? Yes. Okay, great. So thank you very much to New Lines Institute. Thank you to Elise and Charles for organizing this event, for inviting me, to Elise for being a great colleague when we work together. It's going to be hard to follow Ted's very, very astute analysis, so I'm going to maybe kind of zoom out a little bit. So I want to begin by acknowledging, and I think this was already acknowledged in the first panel, that we're in a difficult moment, both in the United States, but also not only in the United States. And I think we're in a difficult moment for 2 reasons that relate to how we approach transnational repression. One, of course, is how the view on immigration as a net positive has shifted. We no longer view immigration, lots of governments no longer view immigration as a net positive. But the other thing that has shifted, of course, and many people in the room today have been impacted by this, is the reduction in funding for civil society. Both of these things make work on transnational repression harder. The first because, of course, people who are subjected to transnational repression are from other countries. They're diaspora communities, they're migrants. And second, because honestly, and not to kind of hog credit, but the best research and data collection on transnational repression has been done by civil society. It hasn't been done by governments. And in fact, governments continue to rely on civil society to provide them with all kinds of data. And not only data, but also inroads to diaspora communities and activists who can talk about the kind of personal impact of this. So we're seeing the confluence of two trends that I think are going to be detrimental to continuing work on transnational repression. Charles asked that we talked about some of the challenges to legislation, and I think some of the practical challenges have been well covered already. So maybe just to talk about what is solved with legislation for tackling transnational repression. I think there are two things, right? Transnational repression is a threat to the exercise of fundamental freedoms. So we would like to protect people. And the second thing that transnational repression is, and this was already covered in the first panel as well, it's a violation of sovereignty. So we would also like to hold perpetrators to account. How can we do that? Well, protecting people is about prosecuting transnational repression when it happens domestically, but I think it's more about actually empowering communities, and that means community outreach. And that has that's been done well by some countries. I'm thinking specifically of Canada and Australia, who have done public outreach, privately, but also launched campaigns. Some of that was being done by the U.S. government in a previous administration, and that definitely needs to continue because ultimately communities, diaspora communities, need to feel a part of their host countries. They need to feel their rights, they can exercise their rights freely, and that they will be protected. And that's something that you do through outreach. The second part around sovereignty. So again, domestic prosecutions, I think, are legitimate. They send a strong message. But ultimately, what needs to happen is that you need to pursue accountability with perpetrator governments. And that happens through foreign relations, right? That happens through visa restrictions. But we saw kind of a softening of relations, even as the G7, which Canada had the presidency of, continued its campaign. We saw that sort of bilateral relationship changed. Of course, the United States has government responses have come under the umbrella of foreign information manipulation and interference, so FIMI. And on the one hand, you can see why that is, right? You use the tools that you have. Many governments have already kind of a legislative and practical framework around tackling FIMI. But one of the problems that putting transnational repression under the umbrella of FIMI creates is that it makes transnational repression much smaller, and it sort of overlooks the specific vulnerability of people who are subjected to transnational repression by making it seem that this is just sort of, foreign interference is a problem for all of us and we're all equally impacted. And I wanted to just reflect on something that Tenzin said in the previous panel, which is that people are subjected in very specific ways, and their vulnerabilities are exploited by authoritarian governments. And that means that we need to offer them specific kinds of protections, and we need to kind of design our policy solutions for those people. And that tends to get overlooked in the sort of FIMI framework and approach. I'll just finish by saying that I think the most important thing that can be done legislatively in the United States is that, yes, we do need a codified definition of transnational repression. That seems like a little lift. It seems like something that should have been done already. And the other thing that I'm struck by is, I don't necessarily want to put myself out of a job, but government needs to collect data on transnational repression. And there is a reporting mechanism in the United States. It's imperfect. But I, for one, would like to see actually government-vetted data on the occurrence of transnational repression across the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Yana. We turn now to Deanna Pelsing. Deanna is a research associate at the Congressional Executive Commission on China, handling the Commission's long-arm portfolio that tracks PRC transnational repression and aligned influence efforts beyond its borders. Prior to her time at the CECC, Deanna worked in the U.S. State Department's Consular Affairs Bureau and at the Chertoff Group, a geopolitical risk consulting firm. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Charles, and thank you so much to New Lines. I know that we're all sending lots of thanks for you having this great idea for this working group, and especially bringing together groups and individuals who focus on all different types of transnational repression from different perpetrator countries. As you probably gathered from my bio, I work at the CECC, which is focused on China, and so it's very easy to get siloed into our own individual countries and perpetrators and different methods of TNR, so I'm so glad to see this group coming together. Today, I'd like to zoom out again, following those two great panelists, and to look at three main talking points of this working group in general, coming from the perspective of a China human rights analyst. The first being why we need legislative action to counter TNR. The second being what this legislation needs to include in order to be effective. And the third being how to actually get this legislation passed. First off, for those who don't know, the CECC, the Congressional Executive Commission on China, where I work, is a bipartisan bicameral commission that was founded in the year 2000 in order to focus on human rights and rule of law in China and to track those developments in an annual report. So we've been doing that dutifully for over 25 years now, tracking the PRC government's human rights abuses within their borders. Back in 2020, we created a new chapter that I now cover called the Long Arm chapter that focuses on transnational repression and foreign malign influence coming from the PRC. So we created this because we saw an increase in PRC human rights abuses beyond their borders. And since that increase that we noted in 2020, we've only seen a continuation, definitely not the PRC government backing down from this intimidation, harassment, and surveillance of PRC diaspora groups or critics of the CCP regime. The first panel already discussed at length the severity and the widespread nature, so I won't belabor this too long, but in terms of why we need legislative action to combat TNR, as many have noted, almost every authoritarian nation utilizes transnational repression to silence dissent and to intimidate diaspora members abroad. But again, as much research has shown, especially from Freedom House, I'm grateful to them, is that the PRC by and large is the most prolific perpetrator of this repression. And in our research at the CECC, like I said, in recent years, we have not seen the PRC backing down on this. And it's important for us to remember that the PRC government, in using this transnational repression, they're using a whole of government approach. It's starting at the top with party leaders like Xi Jinping and other Politburo members frequently saying in their speeches terms like fighting the overseas struggle of transnational repression, or not transnational repression, fighting the overseas struggle of those who are criticizing the CCP. This then also seeps into agencies like the NPS and the MSS, who then come up with more devoted strategies on how to combat this, how to target specific individuals and groups who are abroad. And then it even seeps down to ordinary consular officials, students, and just regular citizens abroad who are called upon to intimidate their fellow diaspora members. Such a comprehensive whole-of-government approach coming from the PRC requires a whole-of-government approach from the US, most notably. And so that brings me to my second point: what should such a response look like? I'd like to discuss just a few points that any legislation on this topic should include. Like Ted mentioned, there's already a few that have been introduced in the House and the Senate. The first is defining transnational repression. This seems, again, like Yana said, a very simple step, but it has yet to be done. And if we're all talking about different things with different understandings of what the term means, nothing's going to get done. We can't track it, we can't fight against it accurately. The second is establishing an interagency strategy between the Department of State, the FBI, the DOJ, and any other relevant agencies, because transnational repression does not just come under the State Department's purview. It should have the attention of DOJ's prosecution power, the FBI's law enforcement efforts, and any others that are relevant. Speaking of law enforcement, as Ted already mentioned as well, this legislation needs to call for the coordination of law enforcement efforts and more training. By and large, the most common refrain we hear from victims of transnational repression, especially by the PRC government, is that when they report
when they're brave enough to go forward and to report that they're victims of this, the FBI, local law enforcement don't know what to do about that. And so they feel unempowered to go forward and to report because law enforcement officials don't know what it is and they don't know what to do about it. Lastly, again, similar to what Yana said, I think that we should have more comprehensive TNR reports from the Secretary of State, the DOJ, and any other relevant agencies, just because that would continue to increase awareness within these agencies so that they can look back and see what the threats have been this year and what new creative solutions they can take moving forward. Interestingly enough, all of these points are included in the Transnational Repression Policy Act, which, as Ted mentioned, has been introduced in both the House and the Senate already by members of the CDCC, a bipartisan coalition. But this policy doesn't just apply to China, it applies to all perpetrating nations, which is also really important. So finally, how do we get this legislation passed? That's the key question, and I hope that this working group can come up with some good solutions to that. I have two ideas of what could help pass this legislation as it is currently sitting in these committees of both the House and the Senate. The first is to get the public's attention, because when there's public attention, that gets the attention of members, and that gives them an impetus to actually push it forward in committee. If they're not being told by the press or by their constituents that this is a problem, then they're not going to care enough to push it forward in committee. The second is also getting the attention of key members and coalitions within Congress, so leadership offices, the Speaker's office. We often see the same members come to transnational repression events on the Hill, and it's great. We're so grateful for those that care deeply, like McGovern and Mr. Smith, who come, but we need the attention of more so that they have a larger coalition to push this forward. With that, I'll wrap up there, but I'm excited to continue the discussion.
Thank you, Deanna. Before we get to Sandra, I'm just going to ask the panelists to turn off their microphone when they're not speaking, or just give a little bit of feedback. Moving on. Last but not least is Sandra Grossman. Sandra is a founding partner of the law firm Grossman, Young & Hammond, a leading immigration and international human rights law firm located in DC and Maryland. She speaks and publishes frequently on transnational repression and twice testified before the Congressional Helsinki Commission on how to curb autocratic abuse of Interpol. Sandra, you.
Is this on? You're one of the perpetrators that kept it on. Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Charles. Thank you so much to New Lines Institute. I want to say that most of my work is around immigration law and Interpol abuse. So I'm a little bit different than some of the other esteemed panelists, that I represent individuals that are targets of transnational repression, and so involved in kind of the daily impact of that here in the United States. And I want to echo a little bit what Nate and Tenzin were talking about, which is this dynamic that we are seeing of people retreating into fear and silence, right? And I think that's the problem for so many of us on the advocacy communities. We need people to talk about what they are experiencing, but when you have ICE breathing down your back because you are not a US citizen, it becomes really difficult to do that. And when the main sort of motivating factor for ICE is fulfilling their quotas on deportation and nothing else really matters, it becomes really difficult to have a voice. Which is why the role of nonprofits, legal aid organizations, and private law firms and independent judges is so important these days. So as an immigration attorney, I can confidently state that the effects of transnational repression are, I think, most consistently felt in the United States through the US Immigration Service and through the various different agencies that play a role in immigration: Department of Justice, Department of State, and the Department of Homeland Security. I like to start these with a very brief example of how I'm seeing this play out these days, and this involves a client of ours who's a Sikh activist, and he and his wife entered the United States back over a decade ago without any criminal history, lawful entry to the United States. The family had fled India after experiencing persecution and torture because of the husband's Sikh activism. And this persecution was primarily in retaliation because of that activism on behalf of his community. Just last year, i.e. a few days ago, under false pretenses, the Department of Homeland Security lured the wife and child, who had just turned 18, into appearing at what we all thought was an asylum interview at U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. Instead of an interview, they were both arrested and detained by ICE and sent to a remote immigration facility. And ICE confirmed to the lawyer that was present there that this was because of an Interpol red notice. In fact, we had been able to successfully delete through advocacy before Interpol the husband's red notice, which was exactly the same as the wife's, but because of backlogs at Interpol, it was taking forever to delete the wife's red notice. The immigration judge promptly refused bond, even though neither the wife or the child was a flight risk or a danger to the community. And it was only after amassing significant resources, and access to justice it's a continuing problem for people that don't have resources, obviously, in the United States, but we were able to obtain habeas corpus relief in federal court and finally get these individuals out of ICE detention. So this is just one example of how we're seeing U.S. law enforcement agencies act on bogus red notices, fabricated criminal charges, and really the dynamic that I observe over and over again is that it's easier for foreign governments to sometimes accomplish in our own country what they cannot do in their country. So when we talk about advocacy and how to communicate around this message of TNR, I think that's one way to do it, to talk about sovereignty, to talk about cooptation of our law enforcement agencies. We've talked a lot about ICE today in this room. Critically, ICE arrests are considered civil in nature, and they have broad discretion to arrest foreign nationals in the United States. I think many of us will argue and do argue that what's occurring now is an abuse of ICE discretion. And not only that, I think it's important to talk about that ICE has a directive, which is Directive 15006.1, which was passed internally in 2023 after the trap provisions, which actually requires ICE to take a much more nuanced approach to targeting individuals that have red notices in their name, right? They're supposed to engage in a substantive preliminary review to determine whether there has been abuse or non-compliance with Interpol's rules. They're supposed to provide individuals with a quote-unquote meaningful opportunity to contest the red notice or its contents, among numerous other protections that are laid out in this directive, which, as far as I can tell, is still in force. So none of this is happening. ICE is failing to implement its own directives or even the spirit of these provisions, right? So in the past, when Ted and Nate and I have participated in these events, we've talked a lot about how ICE can play a role in curbing autocratic abuse of Interpol and curbing TNR in the United States. I think that I don't know, maybe I'm being pessimistic, but it feels like an exercise in futility these days to expect ICE to be involved in holding due process and individual human rights concerns under the context that we are currently living in. But that said, this is the law, this is their own directive. So I think, when we talk about advocacy, we should remind lawmakers about these policies. So in terms of recommendations, my colleagues I agree with all of theirs. I think the issue of transparency and data gathering is critical. Why? Not just because our government is supposed to be transparent, but also because I think for us, it gives us the tools that we need when our clients can't speak up, right? It allows us that access to data that allows us to be better advocates. I also observe as an immigration attorney that sometimes in our government, often the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing, right? So you may have within Department of State's effort to combat TNR, to take a more careful look at red notices, but when DHS is just willy-nilly targeting people and then not providing information about it, we don't have a concerted approach. I think any new legislation needs to focus on enhanced public reporting. I think improved ICE review procedures, mandating that they implement their own directives and that they train their agents on recognizing TNR and Interpol abuse is important. With that legislation that improves interagency communication. And then also, I think reporting from State Department is key. We see TNR play out as well in visa revocations and denials, which have serious impacts on individuals both in and outside of the United States. So thank you again for the invitation and happy to continue discussing.
Thank you very much, Sandra. I have some prepared questions for our panelists, but I want to first just open up and see if anyone has any questions amongst the audience before I get to any of those. No? All right. Yana, I'm going to start with you. You mentioned FEME and how perhaps it is not the best way to categorize transnational oppression. Have you, sort of in your research on Freedom House's research, seen this mismatch lead to sort of real-world failures to protect individuals?
I can't tell if this is on. Okay, I think that's on. Okay. I haven't seen. So I guess the problem with FEME is that we're not all equally at risk of transnational repression. And what I mean by that is, the Chinese government may have a problem with what I do in my work, but they have to try and go through normal and, sort of leaving aside sort of the extrajudicial, extraterritorial assassinations, things like that. Normally, to target me, they would have to go through normal kind of legal international channels. They couldn't do something like threaten my grandparents or visit my family home, things like that. So I think part of the reason that the FEME model is sort of incomplete is because it ignores these specific vulnerabilities, like having family in your home country, having a foreign passport that you travel on that gets you detained. So I think that's one problem, and I think there's kind of a double-edged sword that happens where you see the profile of transnational repression being raised, but sort of on the wave of FEME concern. So I'll take Canada as an example, right? One of the reasons that transnational repression became kind of a big deal in Canada is certainly the assassination of the Sikh activist a few years ago, but mainly because there was suspicion that the Chinese government had tried to interfere in 2 federal elections. That was really what motivated the government. And that's a legitimate concern, but the problem is that, as many diaspora in Canada will tell you, they have been talking about the ways they have been targeted for years and years and years before that. So I think that's kind of the issue with the FEME framework. I think in terms of like failures to protect, maybe this goes back to the self-censorship and how widely spread transnational repression is. I think people who are well-known activists actually get pretty good protection, in part because they have a high profile and they already have kind of government connections. But of course there are, hundreds, if not thousands of people who don't have a high profile,
who may, like Uyghurs, who may be targeted not because of their activism, but because of their identity. And those people, I think, struggle to be protected, to be heard, and they face all of these problems that we noted with reporting, with police response. So those are kind of the issues that I see.
Thank you. I want to turn to Sandra. You mentioned an example involving ICE complicity in TNR and focused your remarks on how TNR plays out through the U.S. immigration system. Do you see other agencies such as the Department of State or DOJ also contributing to this dynamic? What reforms or legislative action would you recommend for them?
Thanks, Charles. Yeah, and so this plays out in numerous different ways, and I have to tell you, I've sat in meetings with representatives of consular affairs from Department of State when I was a liaison with American Immigration Lawyers Association, where Department of State officials have said, this is under previous administrations, that they don't revoke or cancel visas just because of the existence of a red notice, which would make sense, right? Because red notices in and of themselves don't rise to the level of probable cause that's needed to even effectuate an arrest in the United States. And we've talked about this a lot, they're inherently unreliable. But that said, day in and day out in our practice, we do see the almost immediate revocation of U.S. visas for individuals that have not only persecutory red notices, but also bogus criminal charges in their home countries, places especially like Mexico, Venezuela, which have not been addressed much today. But and on the one hand, and this is what I was talking about with the left hand not speaking much to the right hand, is we're involved in incursions into Venezuela and anti-corruption efforts in Mexico, but then our law enforcement agencies, often ICE, are attributing, conclusive evidence of criminality to criminal allegations from corrupt governments, and then detaining people from those countries here and or denying them their visas, which is a huge deal because it separates people from their families. It separates them from business interests, which often are very in line with U.S. business interests. We are also talking about people who sometimes contribute significantly to the U.S. economy, who are then prohibited from coming in here because of TNR. I bring this up also in order to address Ben's question earlier on, which is how can we talk about TNR to expand our audience, right? So it's definitely involves victims of political persecution, minority groups, diaspora groups, but also business persons with valid interests in the United States. So that's what I'm seeing from Department of State. And then also, lackluster reporting on TNR in the country reports. I think we were all encouraged by the inclusion of a TNR section, and much more is needed to reinforce what's actually happening. And then on the Department of Justice side, again, in the immigration context, judges denying asylum and protection to individuals because they are the target of red notices and criminal allegations, and attributing sort of undue weight on these allegations. And again, any reforms, any legislation really need to address training on these issues.
Thank you for that answer, Sandra. I want to direct the next question to Ted. Today, we've put a lot of emphasis on the Transnational Repression Policy Act as a piece of legislation that would, in our opinion, greatly improve the U.S.'s ability to counter transnational repression. However, it is not the only piece of legislation in Congress that touches on the issue of TNR. Could you very briefly explain how those other ones differ from the TNR Policy Act and perhaps how they would supplement it?
Right. Thank you very much, Charles. There are three other pieces of legislation currently pending. They're all in the House. One is H.R. 2158. The lead sponsor there is Representative Kruger of Texas. This is a really interesting piece of legislation because it's the only piece of legislation that mandates the creation of an office, specifically in DHS, that would actually give an individual responsibility within the U.S. government for pursuing the aims set out in the legislation. I like this approach because I don't think you get action from a government unless you make an individual within the government put some skin in the game and make them responsible for the success or failure of the policy. Doesn't guarantee you're going to get results, but I think you're more likely to get some action if you put an individual in charge of something and say that their career prospects depend on at least appearing to be successful in achieving the aims of that office. So I like that approach, but this legislation doesn't have the depth or the breadth of the so it's good in one area, maybe less good in some others. Then there are two pieces of legislation. One is a Democratic piece, one's a Republican piece. They're fairly similar. The Republican piece is H.R. 2116, sponsored by Representative Evans of Colorado. The Democratic piece is H.R. 2139, sponsored by Representative Magaziner of Rhode Island. They are both aimed to support local law enforcement against TNR. The Democratic bill is probably the stronger of the bill because in addition to promoting awareness and community outreach on TNR, it actually mandates better training of state and local law enforcement, which I think is better than the Republican approach, which is just community outreach. Still, they're both valuable efforts. What I would say that they're lacking is we need better reporting from state and local law enforcement, and DHS is the appropriate venue to achieve that. As I said in my earlier remarks, although I'm very supportive of improved federal reporting requirements, we really need to engage state, local, and tribal law enforcement on this as well. And a DHS reporting requirement coupled with a definition of law in TNR. And I will say that all of the legislation I've named here have good definitions of TNR. I will enter a slight regret about the Transnational Repression Policy Act in that it does not include any recognition of transnational repression aimed at business people. And as Sandra has pointed out, this is a big area of TNR. I wish that legislation included business people in addition to journalists and human rights activists and all the other categories that it named. So, my wish is that you take the good parts of all of these pieces of legislation, take the part that could fit into an NDAA, which is most, but not all, and get all of the sponsors and the co-sponsors behind this legislation, go to House and Senate leadership with a 3 or 4 item long wish list for the next NDAA. Whatever doesn't fit in the NDAA, leave it aside, back those 3 or 4 things, and try to get them into the next NDAA.
Thank you, Ted. I have the sort of final prepared question for Deanna. So as you mentioned, at these events, and the people who are co-sponsoring these bills tend to be the same names. And whether legislation is going to be sort of on its own, as its own piece, or something like Ted suggests, where we put some of it into an NDAA, it still seems like these bills constantly come up against the same problems. Frankly, in some of our opinion, it's just TNR is not a big enough issue for a lot of people on Hill. How are some ways that we can maybe raise the profile of TNR and get more people, even on the committee side, to support this legislation? Is it just a groundswell of awareness amongst constituents? Is there another way we can achieve that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Oh, sorry, I think that was a problem earlier. So I have a few ideas for this. I think that it was said in the earlier panel that it also just has to be understood that unfortunately the situation that we're in right now is that so many bills in Congress just don't get passed. And so you have to have an alignment of the stars in a sense, but that also comes with a lot of hard work from those of us at the bottom. So the first thing that I mentioned earlier is public awareness and also in the press. Now this is kind of a catch-22 situation because, as others have said, we've seen a lack or a downfall of reporting because of lack of funding in this past year, and I'm very sympathetic to that. At the CECC, we've had a lack of civil society sources that we can cite to, and so that also makes it harder for us to raise awareness for this on Capitol Hill. I'm encouraged by the growth of some new grassroots media outlets, especially Uyghur News Network, who I know is here today, and many, many others. And so I encourage them to keep up the good work in that, but also it falls on us. Those of us who know about transnational repression, it's up to us to spread awareness in our circles, both personally. I mean, personally speaking, so many of my family and friends, they take a long explanation for them to even understand what the term transnational repression is. And I'm sure that that's the case for many of you as well. Spreading awareness personally, but also in your professional circles. And this gets to my second point of spreading awareness on Capitol Hill in key leadership offices. Leadership offices, such as committee chairs and the Speaker's office, have a lot of priorities and a lot of competing interests that they're working between. The best way to get their attention is to just continue to push this forward. If there are op-eds in major news outlets, if there is a groundswell of independent news outlets reporting on this, those need to be pushed to them through any connections that you might have to those offices. And also through their constituents, because a lot of members of Congress may not know that this is happening within their districts. And if they knew that they have Chinese diaspora members who are being targeted, not just on US soil, which is an abomination, but in their districts, I think that they would care a lot more. So again, personal connections, public awareness, I think those are key.
Thank you very much. We have time probably for one short question. See the gentleman in the back there.
Hi, I'm going to go straight into those comments. I'm Simon Milaness with the Business for Genocide. So here with my colleague Julie Millsap. We've been working hard on getting these TNR bills passed by reaching out to our network of supporters around the US, getting them to write their members of Congress, get them to co-sponsor the bill. Your comments around getting committee chairs and House leadership, Senate leadership on board is very good. That's something that we do. And we have people in every district. On the committees of jurisdiction, you need to remind me a little bit about it. I mean, imagine it would be foreign affairs, judiciary, and armed services if you're going for NDAA. Are there any other committees where we should go after leadership and members, particularly with constituent in district meetings, which we like to do?
The only one that immediately comes to mind that I would add is intelligence, but I think that is well.
Any other real quick questions? Do we have any from the live stream? No? All right. Thank you, everybody, for coming to attend. Thank you, speakers, for taking the time out of your day to come speak and join us at this event. That concludes the second panel. I myself am going to give just a few remarks at the end, and then I encourage everyone to enjoy the lunch that we have in the back. Also defending human rights in general. I also want to thank the members of the CECC staff, as well as their staff directors and the Congress people for also leading on this issue. While we ended today with a discussion focused on policy, I think it is important to remember, and once again center, that this is all informed by personal experience of the people who suffer from transnational oppression. Transnational oppression affects these people in a multitude of ways and their communities. It sows fear, it fosters distrust, and it destroys lives. For every person who has the courage to stand up and speak about their experiences, for every person who makes the news headlines, there are countless others who are silenced. The most successful cases of transnational oppression are the ones that we will never hear about. Ultimately, the reason that we need effective policy to counter TNR in this country is not just because it's a violation of one person's human rights, but it's an undermining of everyone's human rights. It is also because transnational oppression represents a dangerous undercutting of the systems of government that are the cornerstone of democratic society. By letting governments extend their domestic systems of repression outside of their borders and allowing them to impose those systems on people residing in this country and other democratic countries, we are allowing these authoritarian governments to violate the national sovereignty of the United States and make this country a less safe, less free country for everybody. Bills like the TNR, Transnational Repression and Policy Act, would mark an important first step in improving the U.S. government's response to transnational oppression. However, it will take a coalition of policymakers, civil society organizations, diaspora community groups, some of which were represented today, to truly make up the difference and strengthen this country's response to TNR. This is where New Lines finds its niche. By launching this scholarly working group, we are bringing together some of the best scholars in the field and bridging the gap between the academic study of TNR and the governmental policy-making process. New Lines ultimately plans to craft cutting-edge research into novel, actionable policy solutions, which will both better inform our partners in government and add to the great research already coming out from the wider community fighting against transnational oppression. Once again, I thank you all for attending today, both in person and on the live stream. I hope you all found the discussions and ideas put forward today enjoyable and interesting, regardless of the subject matter.